every Russian schoolboy knows. Hello my friends, this is Grandmaster Alex Yermolinsky. Welcome you all back to my weekly show, What Every Russian Schoolboy Knows. I am getting a lot of feedback from you guys and messages that I find on the Internet Chess Club. And some of them, were appreciative of what I've done lately, but some of my listeners, they expressed their desire to see more of the basic endgame work. And that's what I'm going to address. I'm going to go back to the very basics, and I'm going to be talking pawn endgames. This is planned to go on for the entire month of April, and I think that during those 5, because there's 5 Sundays there, during those 5 meetings we can cover a lot of ground and pretty much lay out that groundwork that will help us to develop good understanding of how to play pawn endgames. Well, pawn endgames, they're also referred to as king and pawn endgames, and indeed, shouldn't forget about the king. As a matter of fact, most of pawn endgames, they played with kings. So kings go and they fight and they battle. Well, how do kings battle each other? Well, kings cannot approach each other. They cannot check each other away. That battle is being conducted from a respectable distance. Kings will always be separated by at least 1 square, and what they really battle for is space. I decided to skip some of the most primitive, I would say, endgames, king and 1 pawn versus king, or 1 pawn each. Those, I think that would be just repeating the obvious. I know for many of you what I'm going to talk about today in the future meetings is also obvious. But that obvious is made obvious by your ability to calculate. Calculation obviously is the main tool. I use the word obvious again, I apologize. Is the main tool for playing pawn endgames. Simply because of our ability to calculate accurately and fairly deep. Because there are no surprises. Most of the moves that we look at can be predicted. So we actually are better calculators in pawn endgames than practically any other type of position. Yet, as complexity grows, sometimes calculation alone is just not enough to get the job done. Besides, one shouldn't forget that we enter a lot of pawn endgames via transition to it, when we have other pieces on the board and we sit there and think, what's going to happen if the last pair of pieces is exchanged and we get to the pawn endgame? So that makes it more difficult to calculate accurately in a practical game. And we also could get low on time, very low on time. So the purpose of our study is to firmly establish methods and guidelines that would help us to correctly evaluate and flawlessly play out certain basic king and pawn endgame positions. And we're going to go from ground up, which in our case is going to be 2 pawns against 1. Please turn your attention to the position on the board. What white has here is an extra pawn, and it's not just an extra pawn, it's a protected passed pawn. Let's talk about the virtues of this pawn on b5. It does 3 things in my opinion. Number 1, it is protected itself, and also it provides, indirectly, protection to your pawn on a4. Indeed, if the black king goes on this journey to capture the a4 pawn, the king will be stepping outside of the square of the b pawn, and the b pawn is free to go and make a queen. Well, this is an assumption that we're making, and that this assumption is going to be correct in most cases. More of that later. But let's talk about what other things that the b5 pawn can do. It is keeping the black king in its square. So we count 1, 2, 3, and 3 the other way. 1, 2, 3. Well, that creates the square in which the black king has to stay in order to be able to keep an eye on that pawn. So that's 2. What's the third one? Just bear with me. Alright, we're looking at this situation. What does white need to do to win the game? He needs to gain space for his king. He needs to approach his b-pawn with the king. Well, let's just see how it would play out. First step is to somehow gain the 4th rank, which is now controlled by the black king. The position of the kings is commonly referred to as the opposition. Indeed, the kings oppose each other and they're separated by just 1 rank. What it does, that the side with the turn cannot advance the king. In this case, well, white's on the move and he just cannot come up on the 4th. So what he's gonna do is the following. He's gonna take this battle away from the pawn. The first move is king e3. Black answers with king e5. Notice, he's still in the square. And now white takes one more step, king f3. And that's where the difference comes into play. The black king no longer can continue playing this game. Going to f5 would let the pawn out of his side. So he can't do this. Alright. Black then switches off to what is referred to as diagonal opposition. Diagonal oppositions have tendency to translate very quickly into regular oppositions, be it the frontal one, which we already saw, or possibly a sideways one. Well, you immediately notice that in this case black is unable to maintain this opposition sideways for the same reason. The pawn will go. Alright, so he has no choice but to apply the same method once again. Now comes important moment here. Where should white advance his king? If he goes up on the f file, then black has the d file to oppose the white king. And going all the way to f8, it's not going to do anything because black can step back all the way back to d8. Much better, of course, is to take the 4th. When you work out your opposition plan, it has to have stages in it. In the beginning, we just thought, okay, we need to get to the 4th. Well, by using this fact that the black king was restricted by the necessity of staying in the square, we managed to gain the 4th. So we're back to that. Now he tries to do the same with king e6. We go over and here comes king d6. And now we finally see that there is the third use of our pawn. It takes away an important square, namely the square c6. When white in this position plays his king to c4, that pretty much does it, because black can no longer maintain the opposition. So he has to go back, and he goes over there. Now, well, we could say, alright, the position is solved, but that would be wrong, because there is more to it. A lot of players, while analyzing or playing this position, would apply the same principle of the opposition when it's no longer needed. Namely, they would play king c5 here. Now, granted, the move king c5 does not make it a draw. It doesn't blow the win. But it certainly slows white down, because after the move king b7, white now, I hope, realizes that b6, with the idea of bringing the king over and capturing that pawn, is actually a gross error, because after king a6, white can no longer win. The only move that maintains the pawn is king c6, but that's, hey, stalemate. This simple example should warn us that the opposition has its uses, but it's not the ticket to play every pawn endgame correctly. Because opposition, and more about this later, it's only part of a larger theory, which is known as the theory of corresponding squares. What it is really is we need to establish, I will play this move again, we need to establish a certain position of the kings. When the white's king, white is always the attacker in theoretical studies. When the white's king is maximized his advancement, and the black king just found one defensive square. Indeed, white cannot make any progress from this point on. What we need to do is to ask ourselves next very important question. Can black maintain that position? What would happen if it's black's turn to move? And the answer is very encouraging, because black simply cannot maintain this position. If he moves the king away, which I suppose, he would go to c7, then nothing stops white from pushing the pawn forward with check. And now the black king is too far away from the a6 square. He would go back to b7, and white then would take the b5 square with the king, then capturing the a pawn. Once we establish that, the next order of business is to forget about opposition and think in terms of how to force the position with the white king on c5 versus the black king on b7 with black's turn to move. Well, the way we do it, we start going around that key square and see if he can go around his key square, which is b7 versus c5, without stepping on it. As soon as he steps on it, well, then we'll take our square and we'll put him in zugzwang. Here it's very simple. Well, he has to go to b6 to stay near the b7 square. White further advances his king, and that pretty much already forces king b7, then king c5 is played, and the rest is very, very simple. Alright, what we gathered from this little research, and I know it's a very simple position, and the absolute majority of you would play this perfectly, and you would not need my help at all. But that's just the first step. Let me now go to our next position. Alright, that's gone a little bit too far. Okay. What I did, I just pushed the whole thing 2 ranks down. And now, well, we need to go back to the basics and think about the number one issue of the protected passed pawn, is the safety of the pawns. Because in order to outduel the black king, our king is going to have to go out wide. And that can only be done if the pawns are really, truly safe against the black king's counterplay. In this case, the answer is fairly simple. Well, they're not. Yeah, white may either try to do what with the king d2, or may just try to go with the pawn. But either way, he cannot win the game because the black king is simply too far advanced. And of course, black queens, even queens first, but it's a draw. Yeah, either way, an attempt to play king d2 and then play king c2 No, it's keeping the black king from stepping out from the path of his pawn. But hey, he's got a stalemate situation, and you better keep it this way. You either play king c1 or b5, otherwise white will lose the game. It is clear from the simple study that some positions with the protected passed pawn, they just fall out of our line of thinking simply because the pawns are not advanced enough. And black is able to do this counterplay with the king running and taking the a2 pawn. Alright. So, can we say now that the further up the pawns are, it's always better for the attacker? What do you think? In my opinion, the answer is no. And I can give you an illustration. Next position coming up. Alright, we have the pawn on b6 now. That's one step further up compared with our original position. Should be good. Well, not at all. King b8. Now we do this. Great. This is how we won the previous position. But now, very unfortunately, we realized that the planned move king b6 actually stalemate. So somehow black benefits from having this little space behind, because he's simply stalemated. He's not pushed back, which would allow white to take the pawn. It's not happening. What in fact is happening is a draw by stalemate. Interestingly enough, that black can also use the defensive method that we already know from that sub-variation of the study with the pawns being one rank lower. He may even lose the opposition and allow white to play b7 without check, and still all the same he plays king a7, and the king c7 move advancing leads to a draw. What I'm trying to do here, I'm trying to raise awareness that opposition has its limited uses, and it cannot be applied to all pawn endgames. Now, this whole thing is a draw, but sometimes, funny thing is that sometimes even the best players may forget about this. They operate under the assumption that protected passed pawns always guarantee a win in pawn endgames, and well, this is one of the exceptions. Without naming names, I would say that recently I've spoken one of the leading American grandmasters about a game he played a while ago, and he admitted that during that game, in being low on time and the heat of the battle, he simply forgot that this pawn endgame is actually drawn. And well, that almost cost him the game. So he was able to win in the rook endgame, but with much more difficulty, and he needed help from his opponent. The original mistake was simply caused by he just blanked out. He forgot that this could be a draw. Alright then. Let us continue. And once again, we need to approach every position as a new one and try to open our mind and think first, are the pawns safe? Well, white once again has a protected passed pawn on e4, and it's on the 4th rank. When we had the same situation with the pawns on a3 and b4 versus the pawn on a4, well, we'll talk about this a little bit later. But we thought about this as the leading pawn being on the 5th, which was always good to win the game, or on the 3rd, which was never good enough because of the possibility of the counterplay. What about the middle ground? What about that leading pawn, the protected passed pawn, being on the 4th rank? Alright, let's see. White plays king b5, trying to go around and squeeze the black king. And no, indeed, it's fairly easy to see that there is no hope in defending this position, because white would just simply advance the pawn forward, and then the king has a path to winning the f4 pawn. All fair. But after king b5, black goes for it. Alright, let's do a little calculation. Pawn forward takes. Now, well, the important thing is that the king can go the other way. By the other way, I mean the king has to step out from the path of his pawn, but he doesn't have to step where the white pawn is, so it would queen with check. It goes the other way. Look what we got here. A pawn on the second versus a new queen. Well, the pawn happens to be a bishop pawn, and we all know that because of the possibility of that stalemate trick, king going to h1 in reply to white queen checking from g3 eventually, the pawn cannot be captured because of stalemate, and it's a draw. That's one shining example of how protected passed pawn may not be. No, it's protected, but it still doesn't guarantee white complete safety and peace of mind that would allow his king to wander to the length of the board and paying no attention to the pawns. Well, the black king may turn the tables on him. Well, it's a specific case. Obviously, we're talking about the f-pawn. The same thing would not have worked if the black pawn was located on the central file, or say on the G or B file, the knight pawn. Because finally, in the final analysis, black can only get to the second rank with his pawn, and the king close by. But in order for this to be a draw, it has to be a rook, bishop pawn. Not the rook pawn, but a little bit later. Let's study this business with the bishop pawn a little bit more. I think I have one more position for you to look at. Okay, how about this one? What I did, I moved the white pawn to the other side, from e4 to g4. Let's see. White goes here, and black decides, all right, I got the bishop pawn, so let me go for it. And he plays forward. Now g5. Well, first thing we noticed that the black king should not be going where it needs to go, mean toward the corner, because here white queens with check. So what he needs to do instead is after g5, go king e2. Well, the pawn does reach the second rank, but the situation is different. White, actually, the main line of this position, white simply checkmates on 3 moves, taking advantage of the unfortunate position of the black king, and also some close proximity of his own king. The move now is king c3, or king c2 if you wish, and in reply to black queening, there is checkmate in 1. You know, it's very interesting. From this I gather that in this position, white needs to be aware of the possibility of king e3 and taking the pawn. In order to fight against it, he needs to keep his king close enough to the c3 square. It's the c3 square, that's the key square. Because from that square, your king will later give support to your queen, checkmating from d2. If white in this position plays king b5, then black is, well, quite able to play this move. And I don't think that white can win anymore. Because in this position, his king is just a bit too far away. You can no longer reach the c3 square. Well, yeah, it's possible to do this kind of stuff. And that helps because the black king is forced in front of the pawn, but still it's such a long journey for the white king that finally the black king reaches the position where it needs to be and demonstrates his good knowledge of basic endgame positions by playing king h1 and forcing a draw. Well, this is the main purpose of our first meeting here in that class of on pawn endings. The first thing that we needed to establish is to make sure we realize that a protected passed pawn, while giving us a lot of advantages, has to be advanced far enough in order to be truly safe from the opponent's king. And the additional factor of the defender having the bishop pawn, f or c, and that could allow him to get through and just reach this kind of position. There is one more here that I would like to offer your attention. This would be a position where the pawn is still on the third, and but that's the rook pawn. Alright, just 1 second, I'll get it out. But so far, like I said, I want to apologize that probably a lot of you who think this is all child's play. But by going slow over these positions, we cover all the bases. And we leave no uncertainty and no room for mistakes. And that would be very useful, very handy when we eventually graduate to studying more complex positions. So just bear with me. There is going to be one more. Alright, here it is. Once again, his pawn is on the fourth. So how are we going to handle this? So we have to go out there. No, well, once again, I don't want to repeat myself, but it becomes fairly clear that if black continues along this lines and going king f4 and king f2, king f4, trying to use the supposition for his defensive purposes, he finally reached the edge of the square, and when white plays this move, well, he can no longer play king g4. So he's going to be losing this opposition battle, and it would give the white king the third rank, after which white can come back to c3 and take advantage of the fact that c5 square is not available for the black king and make decisive progress. Yeah, all fair, but what about this counterplay? How about the move king c4? Okay, we come up as we're supposed to. Now he does this. Well, there is no other side for his king to hide once he captures the a3 pawn. So we should just go forward. The only square for him was b2, and now we get a queen with check. So, this is what I gather from this. When your protected passed pawn is on the fourth rank, and the supporting pawn is on the third, you save from the marauding black king, unless his remaining pawn is a bishop pawn. Then you have to be on the lookout. Alright, so, well, good enough. We covered some bases, and more talk about the those pawn endgames 2 against 1, more talk about protected passed pawns, and then, well, slow, deliberate study, the Russian schoolboy way. Thank you very much, guys, for your attention. This was Grandmaster Alex Yermolinsky. See you next week. Every Russian schoolboy knows.